A young woman stood alone at the edge of the world. That was how it felt. The orphanage door had closed behind her with a sound like a verdict, and the night stretched out in every direction, black and vast and indifferent to the small figure standing in the cold, with nothing but a thin coat and the memory of a slap still burning on her cheek. Her name was Freya Voss. She was 18 years old, and she had just lost the last piece of her mother. The locket had been small, a simple oval of worn gold on a thin chain, small enough to hide in a closed fist. Inside, a tiny portrait, a man and a woman, young and smiling, captured in the first year of their marriage before the hard years came, before the journey west, before the fever, before everything. Freya had kept it hidden for 6 years, wrapped in a scrap of wool, tucked beneath the corner of her mattress in the dormitory, in the space where the wooden frame met the wall. She had checked it every morning before the other girls woke, every night before the lamp was extinguished. It was the only ritual that had made the orphanage feel survivable. Matron Aldrich had found it on a Tuesday. Freya had come back from the laundry room to find the matron standing at the foot of her bed, holding the locket up to the window light. Her expression was not one of curiosity. It was one of appraisal. The cold, calculating look of a woman who has spent years determining the value of things that do not belong to her. "Where did you steal this?" "It belonged to my mother. It is mine." The matron's eyes had not moved from the gold. Orphans do not own gold. When Freya reached for it, when her fingers came within inches of the chain, the slap came fast and flat, and then the matron's voice dropped to something quieter and far more dangerous. "Get out, and if you say a single word about this to anyone, I will have you arrested for theft before morning." So Freya had walked out into the cold with nothing. No locket, no coin, no name that meant anything to anyone in that town. Only the coat and the cold. And somewhere in the back of her mind, like an ember refusing to go dark, the voice of her grandfather. She stood outside the orphanage door for a long moment, letting the cold settle around her. There was a choice to make, and she understood clearly that she was making it. She could knock again. She could go to the nearest neighbor and plead her case. She could make herself small and sorry and hope for the mercy of strangers. Most girls would have done one of those things. She went toward the mountain instead. Her grandfather had taught her to read the land the way other men read books. Eric Voss, her mother's father, a broad-shouldered man with hands like weathered bark and eyes that missed nothing, had grown up in the mountains of Norway before the family made the long crossing west. He had carried the old knowledge with him the way some men carry faith. Not written down, not explained, simply lived, day after day, until it became as natural as breathing. He had taught Freya everything he could before he died. How to find water by reading the lean of the grass. How to tell north from the bark of a pine tree. How to build a fire with nothing but dry moss and the edge of a stone. How to read the color of the sky at dusk and know what the next day would bring. How to set a snare without wasting cord. How to find the places in the rock where wind could not reach. How to be cold and afraid and still keep moving, because movement was the only thing that separated survival from its opposite. And this, most important of all, how to find the places where the earth held its warmth. "The mountain breathes," he had told her once, when she was very small, sitting on his knee while the winter pressed against the cabin walls. It holds heat in its bones, the way a good woman holds warmth in her hands. Find the mountain's heart, little one, and you will never be cold again. She had been young enough then to take it as poetry. She was old enough now to understand it was instruction. The trail up the mountainside was barely a trail at all, more a suggestion, a series of flat stones and compressed earth that a deer might have worn into the slope over many seasons. Freya followed it by feel as much as sight, her fingers trailing the rock face where the path narrowed, her breath coming in small white clouds that the darkness swallowed immediately. The cold was serious here, not the damp cold of the valley, which clung and seeped and settled into the joints. This was a dry cold, clean and absolute, that settled into the lungs like something clarifying. She focused on her feet. One step, then the next. The trail bent left and the rock face rose sharply to her right, and she kept her fingers on the stone as she climbed, using it as both guide and anchor. An hour into the climb, she found the ivy. It curtained a section of rock face where the trail turned sharply left. A thick fall of ancient growth, dark and dense even in winter, clinging to the stone with the tenacity of something that had been there long before the town below existed. She almost walked past it. Almost. But there was a draft, not wind. Wind moved laterally, carried the smell of pine and distance. This came from behind the ivy. A faint, steady exhale, cool but not cold, dry but not desiccating, like the breath of something large and calm and very much alive. Freya stopped. She pressed her palm flat against the ivy and felt the draft against her wrist. Then she pushed the curtain of growth aside and squeezed through the gap behind it. She had expected a shallow overhang, a crack in the rock, perhaps, a place to crouch for a night and nothing more. What she found instead made her stand absolutely still for a long moment, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. The chamber was vast. The ceiling arched 30 feet above a floor of smooth-packed earth. Faint mineral light filtered through cracks in the stone far above, creating pale geometric shapes on the walls. The air was steady and cool, not cold, not damp, preserved, like the inside of a root cellar built by someone who understood the task completely, like the inside of something that had been designed. And then she heard water, a thin, silver sound, the voice of a spring emerging directly from the rock, trickling into a natural basin in the floor, cold and clear and constant. Clean water, the kind that came from deep inside the mountain, filtered through stone over years, tasting of minerals and permanence and things that did not change. Her grandfather's voice came back to her then, clear as the water, close as her own heartbeat. Find the mountain's heart. Freya's legs gave slightly. She pressed one hand against the wall to steady herself, and that was when she felt it. Raised marks beneath her fingers. Not natural formations. Not the ordinary texture of rock shaped by water and time. Deliberate cuts in the stone, made by a tool, made by intention. She leaned closer in the dim light and traced them slowly. Her fingertips followed the lines with the careful attention of someone reading something important in a language they are not entirely sure they know. A symbol she recognized. She had seen it before. In the small leather notebook her grandfather had pressed into her hands the winter before he died. A navigator's mark. A Norseman's claim. The kind of marking a man made when he wanted those who came after to know that a person had been here, had stopped here, had found this place worth marking, and beneath it, 2 letters, worn but legible. EV, the same initials, the same family name. Freya stood in the dark heart of the mountain and stared at those 2 letters for a long time. She did not understand yet. She could not fully. Not the weight of what she was standing inside. Not the meaning of the mark. Not the years of intention that had preceded her arrival here by generations. But she felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been clenched for 6 years. Through the orphanage, through the dormitory, through the cold walk to this mountain, began very slowly to loosen. She straightened. She gathered dry moss from the corners of the chamber where she had seen it clinging to the rock in the places moisture never reached. She found the flat, gray flint near the wall. She struck it with the edge of her boot knife, once, twice, 3 times, until a spark caught and the moss breathed into a small, trembling flame. In the firelight, the chamber came alive. The walls gleamed with moisture that never pooled. The spring whispered in its basin. The ceiling arched above her like the nave of something ancient and unhurried. Freya looked up at the marks on the wall. She looked at the 2 letters. Then she said it aloud. Not loudly, not with ceremony, just quietly, the way her grandfather had always said the things that mattered most. Stone doesn't argue with cold. Stone waits. The flame held. Outside, the winter pressed against the mountain as it always had, as it always would. But inside this chamber, inside this place that had been waiting, it seemed, for exactly as long as it needed to wait, a girl with nothing to her name sat down beside her first fire and began to think about what came next. The first morning came gray and silent. Freya woke on a bed of pine boughs she had gathered before dark. Rough work, improvised, but enough to keep her body off the cold stone floor. The fire had burned down to coals. The spring still whispered in its basin. Outside, beyond the curtain of ivy, the world was locked in the particular stillness that follows a hard night's freeze. She lay still for a moment and took stock of what she had. A knife, a coat, the clothes on her back, a handful of dried berries she had picked along the trail and stuffed into her pocket without thinking. Her grandfather's knowledge, stored not in any book, but in the muscle and bone of her, in the habits of attention he had pressed into her since before she could name what she was learning. It was not much, but it was not nothing. She rose, rebuilt the fire with the economy of someone who understood that every resource had a cost, and began to think like a woman who intended to survive. The work of the first weeks was brutal and methodical and strangely clarifying. She started with the flue. Her grandfather had taught her that a fire inside a closed space was only as good as its ability to breathe, that smoke was not merely an inconvenience, but a killer, patient and silent, that would take a sleeping person in the night without any drama at all. The chamber had a natural crack in the ceiling, a narrow vertical shaft that angled upward through the rock. She spent 3 days clearing it, climbing where she could, using a long branch to dislodge debris where she couldn't, until the draft moved freely and the smoke from her fire rose and vanished as though the mountain itself were drawing it away. 3 days, 3 mornings waking with sore hands and a body that had been asked to do more than it had ever done before. 3 evenings sitting by the fire and running her grandfather's instructions through her mind, checking her work against his words, adjusting what needed adjusting. On the 2nd day, her hands bled from where a sharp edge of rock had caught her palm. She wrapped the cut with a strip torn from the hem of her coat and kept working. There was no one to help her. There was no alternative to continuing. She built her hearth next, a ring of flat stones, carefully selected for density, the kind that held heat long after the flame died down, that would still be warm to the touch 2 hours after the last log burned. She set it slightly off-center in the chamber where the natural airflow crossed, and built a simple deflector behind it to push warmth toward the sleeping area rather than letting it rise and dissipate. The design had come from her grandfather's descriptions of the old hearths in Norway, the ones built not for convenience, but for the specific physics of warmth in cold stone. Then the shelves. She quarried the stones from the rear of the chamber where a section of wall had naturally fractured into workable pieces. The work took her hands from rough to raw to something toughened beyond either, not calloused in the ordinary way, but hardened, deliberate, capable. She set the shelves in tiers against the driest wall, testing each one with her full weight before trusting it with anything else. When the third shelf held without shifting under 120 pounds of pressure, she allowed herself a small satisfaction that was not pride so much as relief. She built a sleeping platform next, flat stones layered to raise her body a foot off the ground, because cold air pooled at the lowest levels of any enclosed space, and the body lost warmth fastest at the surfaces where it touched the earth. The platform was not comfortable in any ordinary sense, but it was correct. And correctness, she was discovering, had its own particular warmth. She hung a small piece of reflective metal, a fragment of tin she had traded for at the general store, on the wall opposite the entrance gap. When the morning light found its way through the ivy and struck the tin, it threw a bar of light across the chamber that served as her clock. It told her when to rise, when the day was at its midpoint, when evening was approaching. Small discipline accumulated, was the only architecture that actually held. She traded at the edge of town when she had to. Early morning, before the streets filled. She had trapped 2 rabbits in her first week using a method her grandfather had shown her with a length of cord, and the knowledge of where rabbits traveled before dawn. She skinned and cured the pelts, traded them at the general store for a small sack of flour and a twist of salt. She kept her eyes down and her words few, and she was back on the mountain trail before most of the town had finished its breakfast. She was not invisible. She never had been. Aldous Crane saw everything that moved through his store. He was a large man in his early 50s, with a face built for authority and a voice that carried across a room without effort. He had come to this territory 2 decades ago with enough capital to establish himself and enough shrewdness to stay established, and in the years since, he had become the kind of man whose opinions settled arguments before they fully formed. When Crane declared something, the town generally agreed. It was simply easier that way, and people in small towns learn quickly that ease has its own value. He watched the girl with the worn coat trade her rabbit pelts with the flat attention of a man cataloging an irregularity. "More skins from the mountain girl," he announced to the 3 men browsing his shelves, his voice carrying the comfortable authority of someone performing for an audience he assumed was always listening. "Somebody ought to tell her the rabbits are going to run out." The men laughed. It was the kind of laugh that required no particular reason, only a target and a speaker with enough standing to name one. He gave her the flour and the salt. He weighed the pelts with theatrical slowness, as though the assessment pained him. And when she left, he watched her go with something that was not quite concern and not quite curiosity, but lived somewhere between them, in the territory of a man who has identified something he does not yet understand. "She'll be begging at our doors come the first real cold," he said, in the tone of a man who prefers his predictions confirmed. His son Virgil, 22 years old and bored with the particular boredom of a young man who has been given too much and earned none of it, leaned against the counter with a grin. $10, says she's frozen solid before the new year. Who's in? Several hands went up. They would all lose. Reverend Stowe offered his judgment on a Sunday, as he preferred to offer most things. From elevation with an audience already seated, he was 55, with the lean face of a man who had decided early that austerity was a virtue and had never reconsidered. His sermons were not unkind so much as they were absolutely certain, and certainty in that quantity tends toward a particular kind of cruelty, whether it intends to or not. "There are those among us," he said from the pulpit, his gaze drifting toward the mountain visible through the church's single east-facing window, "who mistake self-will for strength, and isolation for independence. Scripture is clear. We are not made to live as beasts in the wilderness. We are made for community, for fellowship, for the ordering influence of civilization." He did not say her name. He didn't need to. The congregation nodded with the comfortable rhythm of people agreeing with something they already believed. Dr. Harwick sat in the third pew and offered his own verdict after the service to the small cluster of men who gathered on the church steps. He was 45, educated back east, possessed of a particular confidence that came from having read more books than most people in this territory had seen. He believed in science with the same fervor that Reverend Stowe believed in Scripture, completely and with limited tolerance for evidence that complicated the picture. "Living inside solid rock," he said, adjusting his coat against the cold, "produces a specific category of respiratory damage. The moisture alone, the mineral content in the air, would compromise the lung tissue within a season. Whatever she thinks she's doing up there, her body will inform her of the mistake long before spring." The men nodded. Dr. Harwick's certainty had a different texture than Crane's, more technical, more final. Neither of them had been inside the mountain. Neither of them had any idea what she had built. Bryn found her in the 4th week, or perhaps she found him. The direction of the finding was never entirely clear. She heard the fight before she saw it. The high, frantic yipping of coyotes in a state of excitement, and beneath it, something lower and more deliberate. A sound like a stone grinding against another stone, steady, refusing to give. She followed the sound to a rocky clearing 30 yards off the main trail and found the dog cornered against a boulder. 3 coyotes circling at the edge of their courage. He was bleeding from his left flank and from a tear across one ear that had left the tip hanging at an odd angle. He was not large. He was not particularly frightening in any conventional sense, but he stood in a way that made it clear he understood the situation completely and had decided not to be moved by it. Freya did not deliberate. She picked up a dead branch from the ground, charged forward, shouting, and the coyotes scattered into the tree line with the indignant speed of creatures who had expected easier work. She was left in the clearing with the dog, who now turned his attention from the departed coyotes to her, and regarded her with the same level assessment he had given his attackers. She understood, in the way her grandfather had taught her to understand animals, not as lesser things to be managed, but as minds making reasonable decisions based on available information, that the dog needed time more than he needed her. She reached into her coat pocket, found a strip of dried rabbit meat, and tossed it underhand onto the ground between them. Then she stepped back and sat down on a nearby rock and looked at something else. She came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time she left food and took nothing. Each time the radius of the dog's wariness contracted slightly. On the fourth day, he was waiting at the edge of the clearing when she arrived. On the fifth, he ate from her hand. His teeth were careful, almost gentle, as if he understood that this was a negotiation and that the terms mattered. She named him Bryn. It was an old word from the language her grandfather had spoken in his quieter moments. It meant hillside, the slope of high ground, the place between the valley and the summit. Not quite one thing, and not quite another. She thought it suited him. He followed her back to the cave that evening and lay down by the fire, as though he had always intended to be there. He never left. Old Henrik came to the mountain in the 5th week. She heard Bryn's warning before she heard anything else, not a growl, but a low, interested rumble, the sound he made when something approached that he had not yet categorized as threat. Freya set down the stone she was using to smooth the edge of a new shelf and waited. The old man appeared at the entrance gap with the careful movements of someone who understood that appearing suddenly in a stranger's territory was impolite. He was 72 or thereabouts. The kind of age that stops presenting itself in specific numbers and simply announces itself in the architecture of a face, in the depth of the lines, and the way the eyes have settled into their sockets. His beard was white and his hands were large, and he moved with the unhurried quality of a man who has long since stopped being impressed by anything that isn't genuinely impressive. He looked around the chamber for a long moment, at the hearth, at the shelves, at the flue she had cut and cleared, at the sleeping platform raised off the ground, at the spring in its basin, at the hides hung to regulate the entrance gap. He said nothing for quite some time. Then, "Your grandfather was Norwegian." It was not a question. Freya watched him carefully. "How did you know?" "The flue angle." He pointed upward at the ceiling where the smoke shaft disappeared into the rock. "And the shelf spacing, and the way you've oriented the hearth to the airflow." He lowered his hand. "I knew a man who built like this once, a long time ago, in the early years of this territory. People thought he was peculiar." "What happened to him?" "He died warm in his bed at 91, surrounded by people who had spent 20 years making fun of him and the last 10 asking him questions." Henrik looked at the shelf nearest him, tested its edge with one finger. "They'll come to you too. Eventually." He paused. "After they've finished making fun." He visited 3 more times that month. He was not a sentimental man and not a verbose one, but what he offered was precise and valuable. The knowledge of someone who had spent 70 years paying close attention to the specific behavior of cold in this particular part of the world. How the frost came to the low ground first and the high ground last. How to read the quality of ice on the spring's surface to understand what the rock temperature was doing. How to bank the fire in a specific way that maintained coals through a long night on minimum fuel. He taught without condescension. He left without ceremony. Freya accepted both in the spirit they were offered. Bryn watched the old man with a careful amber gaze each time he visited, body relaxed but attention never fully released. On the second visit, the dog allowed Henrik to scratch behind his torn ear, an honor extended to very few, and Henrik received it with the gravity it deserved. On the third visit, he brought a tool he said he no longer needed, a heavy-bladed knife good for working stone, and set it on the shelf without comment. Freya put it to use the following day. What would you have done in her place? A girl of 18, thrown out of the only shelter she'd known, building something from nothing on a cold mountain while the town below laughed. Would you have gone back? Most people would have. Most people would have decided that pride was too expensive and gone back. But there are some people, and you know the kind, you've met them in your life, who bend but do not break, who look at the thing that is trying to destroy them and build right through it. Freya Voss was that kind. Nora Harwick arrived without announcement on a gray afternoon in the 6th week. Freya heard Bryn's alert, the specific sound he made for humans who were not yet categorized, and was standing at the entrance gap when the doctor's daughter squeezed through the ivy with the expression of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through regardless of reception. She was 16. She had her father's sharp eyes and a quality about her that was different from his. An openness, a genuine curiosity that had not yet hardened into the certainty that ruined him. She was breathing hard from the climb. Her boots were wrong for the trail. Town boots, leather-soled, and she had a book tucked under her arm. "I'm not here to make trouble," she said before Freya could speak. "I just wanted to see." Freya assessed her for a moment. Bryn had come to stand beside her, which he did when he had decided something was not a threat. Why? Because everyone says you're out of your mind. But I've been watching you come down for supplies for weeks, and you don't buy more than you need, and you always buy the right things, and you don't look like someone who's dying. She met Freya's eyes. You look like someone who knows exactly what she's doing. A silence passed between them. Your father would not approve. My father approves of very little. He thinks certainty is the same as knowledge. They're not the same. She held up the book. I brought you this, from his library, Geology and Mineral Formations of the Western Ranges. I thought it might be useful. Freya looked at the book, then at the girl. What do you want in return? Nora's answer was immediate. Teach me what you know. It was a fair trade, the kind that benefited both parties equally, which is the only kind worth making. Nora came twice a week after that, always with a book, always with genuine questions, always with the refreshing quality of someone who asks because she wants to understand rather than because she wants to appear smart. Freya taught her what her grandfather had taught her. How to read weather in the behavior of birds, how to find water in dry ground, how to build a fire in wet conditions, how to preserve food without refrigeration or salt. She taught the old ways not as antiquities but as living tools, and Nora received them that way. In return, the books opened things. The geology text explained what Freya had intuited about the rock, why the temperature held so steadily, how the mineral content of the spring was affecting its flow, what the specific formations near the ceiling meant about the structural integrity of the chamber. The medical text she brought the following week gave Freya language for things she had understood only by feel. What was happening in the body during cold exposure? Why the elevation of the sleeping platform was not just comfort, but survival physiology. Between them, they were building something that neither could have built alone. Nora brought the formal language. Freya brought the knowledge that had survived because it had always been tested against reality. Together, they produced something that was both rigorous and practical, precise and earned. Bryn approved of Nora completely. He demonstrated this by accepting a small piece of dried meat from her hand on her third visit, which was, Freya explained, a significant endorsement. Nora understood this and treated it accordingly. The crisis came without warning on a night when the temperature dropped faster than it had any right to. Freya woke to darkness, not the familiar darkness of the chamber lit by coals. Absolute darkness. The fire was out. The cold had moved in during the night with the quiet efficiency of something that has been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. She sat up and assessed her body before she assessed anything else. Her grandfather had taught her this. Take stock of yourself first, because the mind that does not know the condition of its own instrument cannot think clearly. Her fingers were cold, but functional. Her core was cool, but not dangerously so. She had time. Not unlimited time, but time. She reached for the tinderbox. It was empty. She had used the last of the prepared tinder 2 days ago and told herself she would replenish it tomorrow. Tomorrow had not been kind about that assumption. She felt along the wall for the flint she kept on the second shelf. It was there. Good. But flint needed something to catch. Dry, fine material, the kind that took a spark before it had time to think about it. The moss. There was dry moss in the back corner of the chamber, in the high spot where moisture never reached. She moved through the darkness by memory. 12 steps to the back wall, turn left, 4 more steps, reach down. Her fingers found the moss, and she gathered it carefully, resisting the urge to rush. Rushing with fire materials was how people died. Her grandfather had told her that more than once, with the particular emphasis of someone who had seen it happen. She arranged the moss in the ring of stones, positioned the flint, made herself breathe slowly, his voice steady and unhurried in her memory. Flint never fails you if you don't fail it. Slow hands, clear mind. The fire is already there. You are only helping it find its way out. She struck. The spark caught. The moss breathed into flame. Small, tentative, the bravest kind. She fed it with the care she might have given a newborn animal, adding material in increments too small to be impressive, but too precise to be refused, until the flame had grown enough to accept the first small piece of actual fuel. When the fire was established and the chamber was warm again, and the crisis had passed as quietly as it had arrived, Freya sat back on her heels and looked at the light on the wall. The flame illuminated the marks on the stone, the symbol, the 2 letters. And below them, in the stronger light, a line of text she had not been able to read on her first night in the dimmer fire. She leaned closer. The words were in the old language. The language her grandfather had spoken. The language of the notebook he had given her. The language she had never been formally taught, but had absorbed by proximity and attention over the years of her childhood. She moved her lips as she worked through it, the way she had seen her grandfather do when he was reading something important. Built for those who come after. She sat very still. Built for those who come after. Not found. Not discovered. Not stumbled upon by a desperate girl on a cold night with nowhere to go. Built. Intentionally. By someone who had known that someone else would need it. someone with the same initials, someone who carried the same knowledge she carried, someone who had stood in this chamber before her, possibly in the same desperate circumstances, possibly with the same combination of nothing and enough, and had chosen to build rather than merely survive. For those who come after, for her. Bryn raised his head from the sleeping platform and looked at her with his amber eyes, steady and warm in the firelight. Freya did not cry. She was not sure she remembered how 6 years in the orphanage had compressed that particular response into something very small and very distant. But something moved in her chest. Something old and locked and very tired of being locked. She placed her palm against the letters on the wall. The stone was warm from the fire. The threat came in the 7th week, dressed in official language. Nora arrived out of her usual schedule, climbing faster than her boots allowed, arriving breathless and pale. She handed Freya a piece of paper without speaking. It was a copy of a council resolution. The language was formal and clipped, the kind designed to make a decision feel inevitable. Terms like public welfare and assessment of habitation standards and unauthorized occupation of surveyed land. But the meaning was plain enough. Freya had 30 days to vacate the cave. She read it twice, then a third time, because sometimes the second reading reveals a different document than the first, and she wanted to be certain she was reading this one correctly. She was. Who brought this to the council? Nora's hesitation was answer enough. My father proposed it, but it was Crane who pushed it through. He had the votes before the meeting was half over. Freya folded the paper and set it on the shelf beside the flint. That evening, after Nora had gone back down the trail and Bryn had settled into his place by the fire, Freya stood at the entrance gap and looked out at the town lights below. Small yellow squares against the early dark, warm and ordered, and absolutely certain of their own correctness. She could go down there. She understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has been poor long enough to know exactly what it costs, that she could go down and present herself at the right doors and make the right gestures of compliance and likely survive. She could find work. She could find a room. She could make herself small enough to be tolerated. And in exchange for that smallness, she could have heat that didn't require her hands to bleed for it. She picked up her folded coat from the sleeping platform, set it down again. Bryn sat at the far edge of the chamber near the spring, watching her with the stillness of a creature who has already decided what it intends to do and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. He did not pace. He did not come to her. He simply sat and watched the way he watched everything, with total attention and total patience. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the letters on the wall, the 2 initials, the line beneath them that she now knew by heart. Then she put the coat back on its peg and sat down by the fire. Stone doesn't argue with cold. Stone waits. She was not going anywhere. The morning Henrik came up the mountain for the last time, he moved slowly. Not the careful slowness of a man picking his way up an unfamiliar trail, but the deeper slowness of someone carrying weight that has nothing to do with the body. Freya saw it before he reached the entrance gap. The set of his shoulders, the way his eyes found hers without the usual sharpness, the way he stopped just inside the chamber and held the warmth of it for a moment before speaking. Bryn stayed at Freya's side, which was what he did when he understood that what was coming required her to be steady. The judge signed it. Henrik said, This morning, early, before most of the town was awake. He reached into his coat and set a folded document on the nearest shelf. 7 days, not 30. They reduced the notice period at Crane's request. Freya did not reach for the paper. She already knew what it said. And Nora. Henrik's pause was its own answer. Her father found out yesterday evening. He looked at the shelf rather than at her. She was sent to stay with her mother's sister, 2 days' ride from here, last night. She didn't have time to send word. The chamber was very quiet. Freya had known this was a possibility. She had known, in the part of her mind that ran parallel calculations beneath every decision, that Nora's involvement carried risk, not to herself, but to the girl who was 16 and lived in her father's house and had, in the end, no protection beyond her father's goodwill. That goodwill had run out. She stood by the hearth and looked at the fire. The fire did not offer anything. It simply burned, which was what fires did, impartially and without sentiment. She was alone now in a way she had not been since the first week. Henrik was here in the cave, yes, his large frame filling the space near the entrance, his white beard catching the firelight. But he was 72 years old, and he had already given her everything he had to give. The person who had been her student, her project, her unexpected reason to articulate the knowledge she carried rather than simply live it, that person was gone. That evening, after Henrik had gone back down the trail with the gait of a man spending something he could not replenish, Freya sat alone in the chamber and let herself feel the full weight of it, not the legal threat. Those were practical problems with the mercy of being solvable. It was the silence of Nora's absence that pressed hardest. The absence of someone who had seen her clearly and chosen, deliberately, and at some cost, to keep looking. Freya was not accustomed to being seen. 6 years in the orphanage had trained her out of expecting it. The mountain had confirmed that expectation. People looked at the cave and saw a hole in the rock, looked at her and saw an aberration. Nora had looked at the same things and seen something entirely different. And now she was gone. Bryn pressed his flank against Freya's leg and stayed there, warm and unmoving. She set her hand on his back, breathed. Stone doesn't argue with cold. Stone waits. She looked at the letters on the wall, the 2 initials, the line beneath them that she now knew by heart, built for those who come after. Whoever had carved those words had not carved them in easy circumstances. Nobody built a mountain refuge in comfort. They had built it in hardship, in the knowledge that what they were making would cost them something for the benefit of a person they would never meet. They had done it anyway. She stood up, because there was something the law did not know, and Crane did not know, and even Henrik did not fully know. Something was coming. She had been feeling it for 3 days, in the way her grandfather had taught her to feel such things, not through instruments or measurements, but through the accumulated testimony of everything alive on the mountain. The birds had changed, not in a way that anyone in the valley would notice. Birds moved and changed constantly, and the casual observer learned to see the categories without the details. But Freya had been watching the specific birds of this specific ridge for months now, and she knew their ordinary patterns the way she knew the spring's ordinary sound and the fire's ordinary color. For 3 days, none of them had done any of those things. The jays that nested in the eastern slope were gone, not dispersed, gone all at once, as though a decision had been made collectively and executed without debate. The small winter sparrows that usually foraged along the trail's lower section had moved upslope and then disappeared entirely. Even the ravens, which were the most adaptable and least alarmed of any bird she knew, had pulled back from the ridge 2 days ago and had not returned. The ground animals had been stranger still. A family of foxes had moved their young twice in the past week, each time to a lower, more sheltered position. Bryn had been tracking their movement with his nose and his restlessness, pacing the chamber at intervals that corresponded, Freya was beginning to understand, to each new relocation. And the sky above the ridge had taken on a quality she recognized from her grandfather's descriptions. A stillness that was not peaceful, but held. The way a breath is held before something is said that cannot be unsaid. The light had flattened across the upper peaks, losing its direction, spreading into a diffuse gray-white that made the shadows disappear and gave the landscape the unreal quality of something seen through glass. His voice. When the light loses its shadows, little one, it is because the sky has closed. Something very large is coming down from the north, and it has blocked the sun completely. Not a storm you can see approaching. A storm that is simply there when it arrives. You will have very little warning. Use all of it. She had very little warning. She intended to use all of it. Freya went down the mountain on the morning of the 4th day. She dressed carefully, the heaviest layers she had, the most practical boots, her coat sealed against the wind that had begun picking up from the north in the past 12 hours. She left Bryn at the cave entrance with a specific look that meant stay and watch, which he understood and accepted with the equanimity of a creature who has learned to trust the instructions of someone who has never given him a bad one. The town was going about its ordinary business when she arrived. The general store was open. The smithy was producing its usual sounds and smells. A small group of women stood outside the dry goods shop in conversation, their breath clouding in the cold air. They watched her as she passed. She felt their eyes the way she always felt them, not on her skin, but slightly behind it. That quality of being observed by people who have already decided what they are seeing. She went to the store owner's wife first. "There is a storm coming," Freya said. She kept her voice level and her words plain, because this was not the moment for anything except information. Not tonight. Possibly tomorrow night. Certainly within 2 days. It will be the worst cold this valley has seen in a generation, and it will come fast when it comes. The woman looked at her with the expression people use when they are deciding how to categorize something that doesn't fit their existing categories. "How would you know?" "The birds left 3 days ago," Freya said. "All of them. The foxes have moved their den twice. The sky has been closing since yesterday. The pressure in the air has dropped enough that my dog has been pacing for 48 hours. She paused. These are not superstitions. They are the observations of every person who has lived through a storm like this one and survived it. If you want to know what they mean, ask your oldest neighbor, the one who has been here the longest. Ask what they felt before the worst winter they remember. The woman said nothing. Freya moved on. She went to 5 houses. She went to the church, where Reverend Stowe received her from the doorway with the careful courtesy of a man who considers his threshold a kind of border. She went to the council room, where 2 of the 3 members present were willing to hear her out before shaking their heads. At each stop, she said the same things: the birds, the animals, the sky, the pressure, the specific nature of what was coming. At each stop, she was received with some version of the same response. Dr. Harwick did not bother with courtesy. He was coming out of a house call when she intercepted him on the main street, and he stopped with the expression of a man who has been interrupted by something he has already categorized. Miss Voss. He said her name the way people said the names of things that were technically real but practically irrelevant. Animals don't predict weather. That's not how any of this works. The old methods of observation predate the new ones by centuries, Freya said evenly. They have a longer track record. Superstition, he said, not cruelly, but with the finality of a door closing. I appreciate the concern. Good day. She found Crane at the back of his store, doing inventory. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted through several things before settling on a bland watchfulness. She told him what she had told the others. He listened, the best listener of all of them, because listening was how he had learned everything about everyone in this town, and the habit was too ingrained to suppress, even when he would have preferred not to hear. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're not here just to warn us, he said. No, she agreed. I'm here because children live in this town. Children who had nothing to do with any decision any adult here has made. Something moved in his face. Not guilt exactly, but adjacent to it, the way a shadow is adjacent to the thing that casts it. The cave, he said. It holds temperature. 54 degrees, summer and winter. The spring doesn't freeze. There's enough stored food for 30 people for 3 weeks. The flue handles smoke from multiple fires. If the storm is what I believe it to be, your houses will not hold. The insulation is wrong. The wood supplies are not sufficient for a prolonged drop. And if the ice comes before the snow, doors will seal and you will not be able to get out to gather more fuel. Crane said nothing. He was looking at a point somewhere between her face and the shelf behind her, the expression of a man running calculations. Then he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, Tell me what's actually in that cave, and I'll make the eviction order disappear. Freya looked at him steadily. I just told you what's in the cave. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. She held his gaze for one more moment. The storm is coming, Mr. Crane. What you do with that information is your business. She turned and walked out of the store. Outside, the sky had shifted. Not dramatically, not in the sudden cinematic way that storms arrived in stories. This was subtler, and in its subtlety more frightening. The quality of the light had changed again, deepening toward a flat, bruised gray at the northern horizon, while the air directly overhead held an almost yellowish pallor, the color of old bone. There was no wind. That was the thing that pressed against her chest as she stood on the main street and looked up. There should have been wind. The absence of wind meant the cold was coming from directly above. A vertical drop, not a horizontal push. His voice, when the cold comes from above and the wind does not come at all, it means the air at every level is already cold. It simply arrives. All of it, all at once. She looked down the main street, the warm lit windows, the ordinary movement of people going about ordinary things, the smithy's smoke rising straight up into the terrible stillness. Virgil Marsh was standing outside the saloon with 2 friends, all 3 of them watching her. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "The cave girl is scared of sunshine," he called out, and his friends laughed the way young men laugh when they want to belong to something rather than because something is genuinely funny. Freya looked at him for one long, level moment, the kind of look that stores information rather than offering it. And then she turned and started back up the trail. She had done what she came to do. Whether they listened was their decision to make. She had her own decisions. The first true sign came just before dark. Bryn was at the cave entrance when she arrived, standing with his full weight forward, muzzle pointed north, every line of his body conveying the taut attention of an animal that has received news. Freya stood beside him and looked out. The northern sky had closed completely now. Not the ordinary gray of an overcast day. Something denser, more deliberate. A rolling dark that ate the horizon and moved with the slow inevitability of something too large to hurry. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees in the time it had taken her to climb back from the town. The air against her face had the quality of very deep cold. Not biting, not sharp, but absolute. The way silence is absolute in an empty room. A single flake of snow fell past her, then another, then none. The quiet that followed was complete. Stone doesn't argue with cold. Stone waits. "Inside," she said to Bryn quietly, and he turned and went without argument. She sealed the entrance gap, rolling the large, fitted stone into place from the inside, the way she had done it 100 times, the stone moving smoothly in the channel she had ground for it over weeks of careful work. Outside sound diminished to almost nothing. The fire breathed steadily. The spring whispered. She checked her stores with the systematic attention of someone who has planned for more than personal emergency. The smoked meat on its pegs. Enough. The dried provisions on the shelves. Enough. The fuel stacked against the inner wall. Enough, and then some. The water in the spring basin. Constant, unfailing. She had prepared for 30 people. She had made that calculation months ago, in the quiet hours of early mornings when she had sat with the fire and thought about the town below and what the winter might bring. Because her grandfather had taught her something she had never forgotten. We do not prepare only for ourselves. We prepare for our neighbors too. Because when the long winter comes, we survive together, or we die alone. The storm arrived in the small hours of the morning. Not gradually. It arrived the way her grandfather had described, all at once, as though a decision had been made at some altitude beyond reckoning and executed without transition. One moment the world outside the sealed entrance was still. The next, it was not. She felt it before she heard it. A pressure change in the chamber, subtle but unmistakable, as though the mountain itself had taken a breath and held it. Then the sound reached her through 100 feet of stone and earth, muffled but unmistakable. A roar that was not wind in the ordinary sense, but something larger and more continuous, as though the entire sky were in motion at once. Bryn raised his head from the sleeping platform. His amber eyes found hers across the chamber. She added wood to the fire, methodically, without hurry. The fire accepted it and grew, and the chamber settled into its steady warmth, and outside the mountain, the world transformed into something that bore almost no relation to the world she had walked through 12 hours earlier. She sat by the fire with Bryn beside her and thought about the town below, thought about the wooden houses with their ordinary walls, the fireplaces built for winter comfort, not winter survival, The wood supplies calculated for a normal season. The people who had looked at her and seen a girl with bad judgment living in a hole in a mountain. She thought about Samuel Calloway, 5 years old, small for his age, with the serious eyes of a child who listened to more than adults realized. She had seen him twice in the town, both times walking beside his mother with his hand in hers. He had looked at Bryn both times with the transparent longing of a child who wants something very much and has learned not to say so. He had nothing to do with any of it. Neither did the others. The children, the old women, the people who had not mocked her, but had simply been part of a community that did. The fire burned. The spring whispered. Bryn's breathing was slow and even beside her. She sat with the decision until the decision was no longer a question, and then she stood up. She checked her coat, checked her boots, checked the large lantern she had made from a tin vessel and rendered fat. Practical, wind-resistant, reliable in ways that a candle could not be. She looked at Bryn. "Come," she said. She unsealed the entrance stone. The cold hit her like a wall. Not the sharp, familiar cold of ordinary winter nights on the ridge, but something categorically different. A cold that was not a sensation so much as a condition, total and encompassing, the way darkness is total when every light source is removed at once. Her first breath was painful in the specific way of very deep cold, the airways contracting in protest at what was being asked of them. She pulled her scarf up over her mouth and nose and moved. Bryn went ahead of her into the dark and the driving ice, not running, but moving with the deliberate certainty of a dog who knows what is needed and where it must happen. He found the trail in conditions that made the trail invisible, navigating by memory and scent through drifts that were already knee-deep in the level places, and waist-deep where the wind had found channels in the rock. The lantern held a small warm coin of light in the vast, screaming dark. She moved down the mountain. The town, when she reached it, was barely recognizable. The ice had come before the deep snow. A layer of freezing rain that had encased every surface in a shell of clear, heavy crystal before the temperature plummeted far enough to turn everything that fell afterward to dry powder. Doors were sealed in their frames. Shutters had torn free. In the gray ghost light of the storm, she could see a section of roof on the far side of the street, buckled under the weight of the accumulated ice. She did not have time to think about it. She started at the nearest house and worked outward. To the voices she heard through the sealed wood and ice, she gave the same information she gave to everyone. The cave, up the north trail, follow Bryn. Don't stop moving. Don't stop for anything you can't carry in your hands. Some doors opened. The people who came through them were already frightened in the way that transforms people, strips away the ordinary social arrangements and leaves something more fundamental, more honest. A woman came out carrying her child in both arms. Nothing else. The child's face pressed into her shoulder. A man came out with his hands already showing white at the fingertips, and let her take one of them and push warmth into it until he could grip the rope she had brought from the cave. She moved through the storm in circuits, bringing each group partway up the trail before returning for another. Bryn ran back and forth between her and the cave entrance, tracking each group's progress, appearing at her side when she needed orientation and disappearing again when she had it. The cold was extraordinary. She was aware of it as a constant pressure rather than a pain, which her grandfather had told her to watch for, because the point at which cold stops hurting is the point at which It has begun winning. She kept moving. Movement was heat. Movement was time. Movement was the only argument worth making against a cold that did not care about arguments. Crane came last. She found him on the main street, alone, standing outside his store. The front of the store had taken damage. A section of the facade had buckled inward from the ice's weight and the wind's pressure. And he stood before it, looking at it, the way people look at things they have organized their entire understanding around, when those things no longer hold their shape. Crane turned when he heard her behind him. His face in the lantern light was not what she had expected. She had expected defiance, perhaps, the last refusal of a man who has built his life on being right. But what she saw instead was older than that, and simpler. A man who is afraid, and who has used up all the hiding places he knew for that feeling, and who is finally standing in it without cover. He did not say anything. She did not say, "I told you." There was nothing in that direction worth the time it would take to say it. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." She stepped aside and held the lantern high, and Aldous Crane, who had organized the eviction of a girl with nowhere to go, who had laughed at what she was building, who had named her home a folly and put his name on the paper that would have taken it from her, walked past her and up the mountain trail in the dark, following the light she held for him. She watched him go far enough to be certain of the path. Then she made one final circuit of the street, the lantern swinging in the violent dark, Bryn close at her side, looking for anyone she might have missed. When she was certain the street was empty, she climbed back up the mountain. Before she set the lantern down, she stood for one moment at the threshold and looked at the room. 30 faces, 30 people who had, until very recently, been absolutely certain she was wrong about everything. She set the lantern on the shelf. There was work to do. The fire burned. The spring whispered. "The spring is clean," she said, because that was the most useful thing she could tell them. "The fire holds. There is food enough. Sleep if you can." She looked at Lenora Calloway, sitting near the hearth with Samuel pressed against her side, his small hand fisted in her coat. "Bring him closer to the fire. Not too close. Slowly." Lenora moved. Then she looked up at Freya with an expression that had no name in the ordinary vocabulary. Something past gratitude. Something that lived in the territory of a person who has understood, suddenly and without possibility of returning to not understanding, that they have been looking at the world incorrectly for a very long time. Freya did not hold the look. She turned to the next person who needed something, and then the next, because there was still work to do, and the night was still long, and the storm outside was still roaring against the mountain with everything it had. The mountain did not argue. The mountain simply held. 30 people in a space built for one. It should not have worked. By any ordinary accounting of space and air and the patience required to endure prolonged proximity to people one had, until very recently, actively disliked, it should have collapsed into something unmanageable within hours. It did not collapse. It held. And the reason it held was the same reason the cave itself held. Because the person at the center of it had thought carefully about what a structure needed before she built it, and had built accordingly. Freya moved through the chamber with the economy of someone who has learned that in a confined space, every unnecessary movement is a cost. She assigned places to sleep, the families with young children closest to the hearth, the older people Against the walls, where she had laid the thickest bedding of pine boughs and cured hides, the able-bodied adults in the middle spaces, where they could shift position as needed without disturbing those who needed rest most. She showed people the spring and explained how to draw from it without disturbing the basin's sediment. She portioned food from the stores in the careful amount she had calculated, enough to sustain 30 people, enough to last as long as the storm lasted, with a margin she did not mention because some information was more useful kept to oneself. She worked, and while she worked, 30 people watched her with the attention of people who are seeing something they do not have the existing vocabulary to describe. Samuel Calloway was the first one she was truly frightened for. Lenora had brought him to the cave in the state Freya had feared most, not crying, not shivering, but still. The dangerous stillness of a small body that has spent too much of itself on staying warm and has reached the point where it can no longer afford the energy to shiver. His lips had lost their color. His skin was the gray-white of something that has been too cold for too long. His eyes were open, but not focused on anything in the room. Freya took him from his mother's arms without asking. She brought him to the place she had already prepared in her mind before she reached the cave, a position close to the hearth but not close to the direct heat, shielded from the fire's immediate radiation by a hanging hide that would allow the ambient warmth to reach him without shocking his system with too rapid a change. She knew what very deep cold did to the body's interior logic, how the blood retreated from the extremities to protect the core, how the warming process had to follow that retreat backward rather than trying to override it. Too fast was as dangerous as too slow. The body needed to be led, not pushed. She wrapped him in the warmest of the furs she owned. She placed heated stones, warmed at the fire's edge and wrapped in cloth, against his sides, his feet, his hands. She made him drink warm water in small sips, not hot, not cold, coaxing his system back toward its own rhythms by giving it something it recognized. She did not leave his side for 2 hours. Lenora sat across from her, very still, watching with an expression that was beyond fear. The expression of a mother who has understood that her child's life is in someone else's hands and that all the will in the world cannot change that arithmetic. Bryn came to lie beside Samuel without being asked. He positioned himself along the length of the boy's small body, his own warmth adding to the careful heat Freya had constructed around him, and he stayed there with the absolute stillness of an animal that has understood its assignment. When Samuel's color began to return, slowly, the way color returns to things that have been drained of it, a faint warmth at the cheeks, a slight change in the quality of his breathing. Lenora made a sound that had no name in any ordinary category. Not a cry, not a word, something below language. Freya said nothing. She adjusted the stone at his feet and checked his hands and noted that the fingers were beginning to respond. He would be all right. She moved on to the next person who needed her. Dr. Harwick watched everything. He had arrived at the cave in a state that was, for him, entirely novel. Stripped of the authority that his education and his position and his absolute certainty had given him for 20 years, standing in someone else's space and understanding with the slow, painful clarity of a man who cannot lie to himself that he had been wrong in a way that mattered. He did not try to insert himself into the medical work Freya was doing. He simply watched. His hands, which were accustomed to doing things, were folded in his lap. He had brought his notebook from his coat pocket. Freya noticed it, but said nothing. He wrote in it for a long time. On the second night, when most of the cave was sleeping and the fire had settled into the long, slow burn she maintained through the dark hours, he set down the pen and looked at his hands for a while. The hands of a man who has spent his entire adult life trusting his instruments and is now, for the first time, uncertain whether his instruments have been telling him the truth. "The boy," he said finally, his voice quiet enough not to carry. "What you did with the stones. The graduated warming." "It follows the body's own logic," Freya said. She was adding a small piece of fuel to the fire, watching how it took. "When the cold is very deep, the body narrows. It protects the center by withdrawing from the edges. You warm the center first and let the edges follow. Pushing heat at the extremities before the core is ready creates confusion in the system." Harwick was silent for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "My grandfather. He learned it from his father, and his father from his, going back to people who lived in mountains where getting it wrong meant dying." She looked at the fire. "It is older medicine than yours. It comes from more observations." He wrote something in the notebook, then set the pen down and looked at his hands. "I was wrong about everything," he said. His voice had the quality of something being said for the first time after a very long time of being known. "Not just about the cave, about you." He paused. "I looked at what I expected to see and called it observation. That is not what observation is." Freya looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, "it isn't." She did not offer him absolution. She was not qualified to offer it and did not believe it was hers to give. But she received the statement as what it was, a true thing said in the dark to the only person present, and she let it exist without diminishing it or amplifying it. He nodded once. Then, carefully, he asked if he could help with anything. What needed doing that he was capable of doing? She told him. And he did it. The children adapted fastest. They always did. By the second day, Samuel Calloway was sitting up and asking about the dog with the earnest specificity of a 5-year-old who has identified a priority and intends to pursue it. "His name is Bryn," Freya told Samuel when Lenora brought him to her to ask. "Can he come here?" Samuel asked. The question was addressed to Freya, but his eyes were on the dog with the intensity of a child who wants something so much that the wanting has become its own kind of gravity. "He'll come if he wants to," Freya said. "He makes his own decisions." Bryn made his decision immediately. He rose from his position, crossed the chamber in 4 unhurried strides, and lay down beside the boy with the air of a creature fulfilling an obligation he had identified some time ago. Samuel buried both hands in the thick gray fur, and his face transformed, not just into happiness, though it was that, but into something more complete. The look of a child who has found exactly what was needed and cannot quite believe it was this easy to find. Lenora stood behind him and watched and pressed one hand over her mouth. 3 of the other children, who had been watching from a cautious distance, drifted closer, then closer still. By evening, there were 4 children arranged around the dog like small planets around a calm and indifferent sun, and Bryn accepted all of them with the equanimity of an animal who has decided that this too was within the scope of what he was here to do. It was the children who changed the temperature of the cave, not the physical temperature which Freya managed with her careful fuel rationing. But the emotional temperature that had settled over the adults since their arrival, the sound of children occupied and not frightened, the ordinary sound of small voices negotiating the terms of a game, moved through the chamber and softened something that had been held rigid with fear and cold, and the shame of people who have been catastrophically wrong. Crane sat alone near the east wall for the first day and most of the second. He watched the work Freya did with the expression of someone engaged in a private accounting that did not require witnesses. He ate what was given to him and drank from the spring when others did and did not demand anything, which was more than she had expected from him. On the second evening, he rose from his place and came to where she was checking the fuel supply. He did not speak for a moment. He looked at the stacked wood, the careful months of her labor, enough for 30 people through a storm of unknown duration, and something shifted in his expression. "I owe you an accounting," he said finally. "You owe several people several things," Freya said. She continued what she was doing. "I'm not the most important creditor." He absorbed this. "No, I suppose not." He looked at the wall. "The eviction order. I'll have it withdrawn when we're out of here. In writing. Before the council, so there's no question. And the land question, there are steps that can be taken. Legal ones. Henrik knows a man who understands that kind of thing." Freya set down the piece of wood she was holding and looked at him directly. "Do those things," she said. "Not for me. Do them because they are correct." He held her gaze. Then he nodded once and went back to his place. The miracle arrived on the third night of the storm, in the way that the most significant things arrive, without announcement, following its own schedule, indifferent to the drama of the moment, and yet somehow, in its timing, perfectly placed. Martha, a woman in her late 30s, wife of a craftsman who had been among the first group Freya brought up the mountain, had said nothing about her condition when they arrived. This was understandable. She had been in the business of surviving the night, and details that might have mattered in a calmer world had reorganized themselves in the hierarchy of immediate needs. But the third night made itself known. It was Lenora who noticed first. The particular change in Martha's breathing, the way she had positioned herself against the cave wall, the expression of concentrated inward attention that women recognize. She came to Freya quietly and spoke without drama, because drama was a luxury that the situation did not accommodate. Freya went to Martha and assessed the situation with the same systematic attention she brought to every problem. Then she organized the immediate geography of the cave, rearranging sleeping bodies carefully, creating a partitioned space near the warmest section of the chamber, directing specific people to specific tasks with the quiet authority of someone who knows what needs to be done and is only interested in its being done correctly. Eli Strand had been awake on the far side of the cave. He was a large man, a craftsman with hands used to precision work, and he had the quality that some people have of being useful in situations that require steadiness, not loudness, not initiative, just the reliable solidity of someone who will do what is asked without adding to the noise. He came when she indicated he was needed, and he did what she directed. And between them, with the cave holding its steady warmth around them, and the storm pressing against the mountain outside, and the fire breathing in its ring of stones, they brought a new person into the world. The child arrived in the deep part of the night, in the hour when the fire is lowest and the darkness is most complete, and the sounds of the storm seem, paradoxically, furthest away. She was small and absolutely certain of herself, and she announced her arrival with a sound that cut through the cave's sleeping quiet and brought every adult in the room to wakefulness in an instant. Not in alarm, because the sound was not alarm, but in the particular attentiveness of people who have heard the thing that means the world has just changed its accounting. Martha held her daughter against her chest and looked at Freya with an expression that held more in it than any single expression should be required to hold. "A name," she said. Her voice was exhausted and completely, utterly present. "Something that means she'll be safe, that she'll be strong." Freya was quiet for a moment. In the firelight, the cave's stone walls were warm and golden, and on the far wall, the carved letters caught the light the way they always did. Ifi. And below them, the word she now carried in her own chest like a second heartbeat. Built for those who come after. "Astrid," Freya said. "My mother's name." Martha looked at the child. Then she nodded, and the name settled into the cave the way names settle when they are right. Without ceremony, without excess, as though the name had been waiting and had simply arrived at the moment prepared for it. Eli sat back on his heels and looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked at Freya. He had been beside her through all of it. The arrival, the long middle passage, the end. And he had not spoken beyond what was necessary. It was the quality she had noticed in him from the first time she had seen him on the main street, standing in the group that mocked her and not laughing, not defending her either. She had not forgotten that, but not laughing. There was a difference, and she had filed it carefully. He handed her the cloth she needed without being asked. Their hands did not touch, but the coordination of the gesture, his knowledge of what she needed before she named it, and the ease of the handoff, and the way neither of them had to recalibrate, registered in some part of her that kept track of such things. When the cave had settled again, when Martha and the child were resting and the adults who had woken had drifted back toward sleep, Freya sat by the fire in the late night stillness that she knew best, the hour when the world contracted to the immediate and everything else waited. Eli sat down on the other side of the hearth. They did not speak for a long time. The fire moved between them, small and steady. He set his hand on the stone ledge beside him, palm down, fingers relaxed, not reaching, not presenting, simply there. Freya looked at it. Then she set her own hand on the ledge on her side of the fire, and the distance between their hands was the width of the hearth, and they both looked at the fire and did not close that distance, and did not need to. Stone doesn't argue with cold. Stone waits. The motif moved through her, quiet as breath. She did not say it aloud. She did not need to. Outside, the storm pressed against the mountain with everything it had. The mountain did not press back. The mountain simply stood and held its warmth and let the storm exhaust itself against something that had been there considerably longer and intended to be there considerably longer still. Inside, the fire held. The spring whispered. 30 people slept or tried to, or lay awake with the private thoughts of people who have survived something and are beginning, slowly, to understand what has changed. Astrid, 1 hour old, breathed with the absolute certainty of something that has just arrived and intends to stay. And Freya sat by the fire, with the warmth of the mountain around her, and the sound of the spring at her back, and a sleeping dog somewhere behind her, and a man sitting across a hearth who had not needed to be asked to stay. And she felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, that the word enough applied to her life. Not comfortable, not easy, not safe in any guaranteed or permanent way, but enough. The fire held, the mountain held, and 30 people held together in the warmth that a girl with nothing had built out of stone and knowledge and the refusal to believe that what had been given to her was all she deserved. There was always more work. But for now, in the deep and breathing dark, the cave held everyone it needed to hold. The storm ended the way it had arrived, without transition. One morning, the sound was simply gone. The pressure against the entrance stone, which had been a constant presence for days, a low and continuous force that the body learned to factor into everything, had ceased. The silence it left behind was so complete that it woke people who had been sleeping deeply, pulling them upward from exhaustion into a stillness that felt, for a confused moment, like a different kind of threat. Freya was already awake. She had not slept in the final hours of the storm, not from fear, but from the alertness that comes when something very large is ending and the next thing has not yet declared itself. She had sat by the fire and tended it and listened to the storm wind down with the attentiveness of someone waiting for a piece of music to resolve. When the silence came, she waited another hour. Then she unsealed the entrance stone and looked out. The world outside was remade, not destroyed, remade. The familiar geography of the mountainside had been redistributed, flattened in some places, and built up in others, the ordinary contours replaced with a landscape of pure, unbroken white that caught the early light and threw it back in every direction at once. The air was cold still, sharply cold, but clean in the way of air that has been scoured and replaced. The sky above the ridge was a blue so absolute it looked like something that had been decided rather than occurring naturally. A blue that had no gray in it, no ambivalence, nothing held back. Bryn came to stand beside her at the entrance. He looked out at the changed world. He took one long breath of the new air. His tail moved once, slowly, and then he was still. Freya looked down toward the valley. The town was there, still there, but the distance between what it had been and what it now was, visible even from the ridge, in the shapes of rooflines that were wrong, in the absence of smoke from chimneys that had been damaged or blocked, was the distance of something that would take a long time to repair. She turned back inside. "It's over," she said to the waking room. "Take your time. There is still food, and the fire is good. But when you are ready, it is over." The return to the valley was slow and strange. People moved down the trail in the same groups they had come up in, but differently, not with the desperate momentum of flight, but with the careful steps of people who are not entirely sure what they are returning to. The children went first, because children are quickest to believe that the ordinary world has reasserted itself. Samuel Calloway half ran down the upper section of the trail with Bryn loping easily ahead of him, and his laughter carried back up the mountain to the adults who followed. Freya came last. She always came last. She stood at the cave entrance for a moment before beginning the descent, looking back into the chamber, at the fire she had banked down carefully, at the spring still whispering in its basin, at the shelves that were reduced now but not empty, at the marks on the wall in the language of her ancestors, built for those who come after. She touched the letters once with her fingertips. Then she turned and followed the others down. The accounting began before the snow had been cleared from the main street. 2 people had not made it to the mountain. An old man who had lived alone at the far end of town, who had heard no knock at his door because Freya had not been able to reach every house in the dark and the storm, and who had been found the morning after the thaw by his nearest neighbor, peaceful in his chair as though he had simply decided to stop. And a woman, elderly and fiercely independent, who had refused to leave her home when 2 men from the group had gone back for her, had sent them away with sharp words and a certainty that she had survived worse, and had not survived this. Freya heard the news from Lenora, who told her with the careful gentleness of someone who understands that certain information carries weight. She stood with it for a long time. There was no satisfaction in what had happened, in any of what had happened. The people who had mocked her and dismissed her and signed papers to remove her from the place she had built with her own hands were now standing in the ruins of a winter they had not prepared for, and there was nothing in that picture worth celebrating. 2 people were dead who might not have been dead. A town was damaged that had not needed to be damaged in this way. The losses were real, and they were permanent, and no amount of vindication made them smaller. Anger was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She saw no reason to start now. She walked through the town and looked at what needed to be done, and she began helping with it. The reckoning came in pieces over the days that followed. Reverend Stowe came to the mountain the morning after the storm cleared, making the climb with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to do something difficult and is not going to let the difficulty change the decision. He found Freya at the cave entrance, assessing what needed restoring in the wake of 30 people's occupation. He did not have a prepared speech. The man who spoke from pulpits had spoken in careful, constructed sentences all his life, and what he said now had none of that architecture. "I spoke about you from the pulpit," he said, "without the courage to use your name. I called what you were doing an affront." He looked at the cave entrance, at the stone that had sealed against the storm. "I was describing myself, I think, not you." He was quiet a moment. "I am sorry for what I said, for the weight that kind of thing carries when the person in the pulpit says it." Freya looked at him. He was 55 years old, and he was standing in front of her without the armor that his position and his certainty had always given him, and it had cost him something to climb this mountain and take that armor off. She could see it in his face. "Words from a pulpit land harder," she said. "You're right about that." "Yes." "Don't do it again?" "No," he said. "I won't." She nodded once. She did not offer him a warm speech about forgiveness. She received what he had brought and let it be what it was. An honest thing, imperfectly delivered, which was the best that most honest things managed. He went back down the mountain with the lighter step of someone who has set down something heavy, even if the setting down had not been painless. Dr. Harwick's accounting took a different form. He returned the notebook to Freya. The pages he had filled in the cave during the storm, copied out carefully in his precise physician's hand, and organized in a way that made the knowledge accessible rather than private. He handed it to her on the main street, the way he might hand a colleague a relevant document. "These are yours," he said. "The observations, the methods. They came from you. I only wrote them down." He paused. "If you permit it, I'd like to write something formal about what I witnessed in that cave. What happened to 30 people who should, by everything I was trained to expect, have suffered for it, and didn't." He said the last part evenly, without flinching from it. It would be a correction of the record. My record. Freya took the pages. Her grandfather's knowledge, rendered in the formal language of a different tradition, precise and documented, and, in that form, portable in ways the original had never been. Write it, she said. Make sure people understand where it comes from. Not from you, from the people who learned it through generations of needing it to be right. He accepted this with a nod that had no condescension in it, only acknowledgement. Crane's accounting was the most formal and the most public, which was fitting, because his offenses had been the most formal and the most public. He appeared before the council, all 3 members, and most of the town, because the town had gathered for the meeting with the energy of a community that understands something significant is being decided. And he withdrew the eviction order in explicit terms, not quietly, not through administrative channels, but standing before the people he had persuaded with the full weight of his standing and undoing what he had done with the same unambiguous language. The eviction order was void. The land occupied by Freya Voss was her land by right of occupancy and use and the recorded will of the council, which he moved to formalize that afternoon. The council voted. It was unanimous. Freya was not at the meeting. She heard about it from Henrik, who attended and told her in his spare, factual way, as though reporting on a routine administrative matter, which was, she thought, exactly the right way to tell it. The land is yours, he said, in writing, filed with the county. Nobody can touch it. She absorbed this. Good, she said. That's all you have to say? She thought about it. It was always mine, she said. Now the paperwork agrees. Henrik made a sound that might, in a younger man, have been a laugh. Virgil Marsh came alone, on a morning when Freya was working at the cave entrance, and the town was going about its recovery business in the valley below. He was 22 years old, and he had the look of a young man who has recently been introduced to the version of himself that he does not prefer, the version that exists in the memory of everyone who heard him shout things from the street, who saw him take bets on a girl's death, who watched him use the safety of a crowd to do the small cruelties that crowds make possible. He stopped at the entrance gap and stood there for a moment, looking at the stone and the ivy and the careful, deliberate construction of what Freya had made. I came to say I was wrong, he said. He said it the way young men say things they have practiced. A little too careful, a little too structured, but genuine underneath the structure. About all of it. What I said, the bets. He looked at Bryn, who was sitting at Freya's side. The dog is... He kept coming back to the doors. That night. In the storm. He stopped. Tried again. My little sister. She was one of the ones he came to. Freya looked at him. He was young. He had done what young men do in the territory between courage and cowardice. He had filled the space with noise because noise felt like confidence, and he had not yet learned the difference. He had done genuine harm with it, in the ordinary way that thoughtless things cause harm, not from malice, but from the failure to understand that other people's lives are as real as one's own. Don't take bets on people, she said. He blinked. What? When you see someone doing something difficult and you don't understand why, don't take bets on their failure. That's all. She went back to her work. You can go. He stood there a moment longer. Then he went. She thought he would probably be all right. Young men who come back and say the thing, even imperfectly, even in the careful, practiced way, usually were. Matron Aldrich came on a gray afternoon when the snow had turned to slush on the lower trail and the mountain smelled of thaw and cold stone. Freya heard Bryn's specific alert from inside the cave, the low, sustained sound he made for people who carried something he did not trust, and came to the entrance to find a woman she recognized standing at the bottom of the ivy curtain. Older than Freya remembered, smaller. The authority that had filled the doorway of the orphanage 6 years ago had been redistributed somehow, settled into her shoulders in a way that looked less like power and more like the weight of things carried too long. She held something in her right hand, closed in her fist. "I heard what you did," Aldrich said. Her voice had the quality of someone reading from a text they have rehearsed but do not entirely believe. "The storm. The people you saved." She paused. "Word travels." Freya said nothing. Aldrich opened her hand. The locket lay in her palm, small and worn and gold. The chain pooled beneath it in a tangle. In the gray afternoon light, it looked exactly as it had always looked, like something that mattered more than its size suggested. Aldrich began. She stopped, tried a different beginning. "There are things I did at that place that I would prefer remain." "No." Aldrich looked at her. "That's not a trade I'm making." Freya's voice was even, not heated, even in the way that stone is even without negotiation or surface to grip. "If you have done things that require accounting, that accounting will happen or it won't. It has nothing to do with me." Aldrich was quiet. Her expression tightened, then went flat. The face of a woman who has run the numbers and does not like what they add up to. It was Crane's voice that came from behind Freya. She had not heard him on the trail. He had come up quietly, for a man of his size, and he stood now at the entrance gap with his coat open and his expression settled into something that had nothing of the old performance in it. "Set it down," he said to Aldrich, not loudly, the way a man speaks when he does not need volume to be heard. "And then I want you to leave this valley. Before nightfall would be appropriate." He paused. "There are people who know things about that orphanage, about the accounting that was done there, and the accounting that wasn't. I have been in contact with some of them. Whether those conversations continue or conclude depends on what you do in the next 30 seconds. Aldrich looked at him. Then she looked at Freya. She set the locket on the flat stone beside the ivy curtain. Then she turned and went back down the trail without speaking, and her footsteps in the slush were the last sound she made. And then the mountain was quiet again. Freya picked up the locket. It was lighter than she remembered. Or perhaps she was simply stronger. She opened the clasp. Inside, protected by the oval of worn gold, were two faces. A man and a woman, young, caught in the moment before everything. Before the journey, before the hard years, before the fever, before the frozen plains, and the night that had ended all of it. They were smiling with the ease of people who do not yet know what is coming. Her mother's eyes, the same gray she saw in the piece of tin she used as a mirror every morning. Her father's hands folded in his lap, large and capable. She had not seen their faces in years. She had been afraid in the way that people are afraid of certain memories, that she had lost the specific details of them, that grief and time had worn the edges away until only an impression remained. But they were here, both of them, exactly as they had been. Freya pressed the locket against her chest for a moment, there at the entrance of the cave her ancestor had built. in the cold, clean air of the mountain that had held her. She did not try to contain what she felt. She let it come. The grief that had been waiting, patient as stone, for a moment when she was safe enough to feel it fully. Her shoulders moved. Her breath hitched. The tears were cold on her face in the mountain air, and she did not wipe them away. Crane stood at the entrance gap and looked at the sky, which was the correct thing to do. He gave her the privacy that the moment required, which was perhaps the most useful thing he had done in their entire acquaintance. When she was ready, she opened her eyes. The mountain was still there. The spring was still whispering inside. Bryn sat beside her with his flank pressed against her leg, warm and steady and permanent in the way that the most reliable things are permanent. "Thank you," she said to Crane. It was only the second time she had thanked anyone in this valley. He nodded. He did not make a speech about it. He went back down the trail. That evening, Henrik sat in the cave for what Freya understood would be one of the last times. He was old, and the winter had cost him something, and the climb was harder than it had been. But he sat by the fire with the contentment of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive. And he looked at the wall where the letters were, and read the full inscription in the old language, aloud, for the first time. He told her what he knew, which was not much, but was enough. A man with her family name, an early arrival to this territory, before the towns came, before the trails were worn. Someone who had understood the mountain and the winter with the knowledge of a tradition much older than this country. Someone who had built this place in the full understanding that he might not be the one to use it. Someone who had prepared for a person he would never meet, because he understood that preparation was not only for the self, built for those who come after. He didn't know who you would be, Henrik said, only that someone would come, someone who carried the right knowledge. He looked at her. He built for an idea. You turned out to be the person. Freya looked at the letters for a long time. She thought about the chain of it, the grandfather who had taught her mother's father, and the great-grandfather who had built this place, and the knowledge that had traveled forward through generations in the form of stories and demonstrations and patient repetition, arriving finally in her hands, in this mountain, in this winter, at exactly the moment it was needed. Nothing had been lost. It had only been traveling. On an evening in the early spring, when the snow had pulled back from the lower slopes and the first tentative green was appearing in the south-facing gullies, Eli Strand came up the mountain. He came the way he did most things, without announcement or excess, with the straightforward intention of a man who has decided what he means to do and sees no reason to make it complicated. He sat down beside her at the cave entrance, where she liked to watch the valley in the evenings, the long light coming in low and golden over the western ridge. "The smithy is going well," he said. "Better than before, in some ways. People come in now and ask questions they didn't used to ask." He looked at his hands. "About building things properly. About what holds in hard conditions and what doesn't." "Good," Freya said. A long and easy silence. "Nora came back," he said. "I thought you'd want to know. She arrived 2 days ago. Her father met her at the edge of town and didn't say anything. Just walked her home." Something settled in Freya's chest. "She'll come up when she's ready." "Yes." He paused. "She will." The valley was lit gold. and the mountain above them held the last of the day's warmth in its stone. Bryn was somewhere on the upper trail, doing what he did in the evenings, ranging the ridge, checking the perimeter, satisfying himself that the known world was in its proper arrangement. Eli looked at the valley for a while longer. Then he looked at Freya. "I'd like to keep sitting here," he said, "with you, if that's agreeable." It was the same thing he had said in the cave in the deep of the storm, beside the fire, when the world outside was trying to end. The same words, the same tone. A man making a clear offer without false decoration, willing to be met or not met on honest terms. Freya looked at him. He was not young. He carried his losses in the way that people do who have loved and been left by circumstance rather than choice, not bitterly, but with a weight that had settled into character, made him quieter than he might have been, more precise with what he said and when he said it. She understood that kind of weight. "Yes," she said. "That's agreeable." He nodded. He looked back at the valley. They sat together as the light went, and the mountain cooled around them, and the first stars appeared above the eastern ridge in the deep blue of the coming night. Time passed in the way it does after the significant things, not evenly, but in layers. Some seasons thick with change, others quiet and consolidating, the ordinary work of a life being built in the aftermath of a winter that had rearranged everything. Nora came back to the mountain 3 days after her return to the valley. She came with a new book, thicker than the others, with her own handwriting on the inside cover. And she did not apologize for her absence because she had not caused it. And Freya received her back without ceremony, because Nora's place in the work had not disappeared while she was gone. She learned everything. She asked better questions than she had before. Sharper, more connected, the questions of someone who had been away and thought and returned with more developed curiosity. She had something of her father's rigor without his rigidity, the useful part of his mind without the part that closed. She would do good work. Freya was certain of it. In the years that followed, other structures appeared in the mountain range, not identical to hers, because the specific conditions of each site required specific responses, but built from the same understanding: stone and knowledge, patience and preparation, the old ways brought forward into new hands. Freya wrote it down, first in one notebook, then in a second, then a third, because the first two filled faster than she expected, because there were more people who wanted to learn than she had anticipated, and because the knowledge, once shared, did not diminish. It multiplied. Astrid grew. The child born in the cave on the worst night of the storm grew with the energy of someone who has been told, implicitly and explicitly, that her first breath was remarkable, not in a way that made her self-important, but in a way that gave her a specific confidence, as though she understood from the very beginning that she had arrived at a significant moment and had a part to play in what came after. She climbed to the mountain cave before she could do it unassisted, held in her mother's arms. She climbed it alone before she was 5. She would ask later, when she was old enough to ask the full question, "What was it like that night?" And Martha would tell her. And the telling would be different each time, not because the facts changed, but because the meaning of the facts deepened with each year of distance from them, gathered resonance the way water gathers in a basin, drop by patient drop. Bryn died on a morning in early autumn, many years after the winter. He had been old for a long time, old in the way of dogs who have lived well, whose age shows in the slowing but not in any dimming of the essential quality that made them who they were. He had remained himself entirely. The dog who ate from her hand on the 5th day. The dog who had gone into the storm without being asked. The dog who had known what Samuel needed before anyone else in the room understood the question. He died at the cave entrance, in the morning light, in his usual position, looking out over the valley, as though he had been watching, as he always watched, and had simply, at some point in the watching, finished. Freya buried him at the entrance, in the ground to the left of the ivy curtain, where he had always lain when the weather was good, and the sun came to that spot in the late morning. She dug the grave herself, and she lined it with smooth stones from the spring basin. She placed a piece of granite over it, and she took her knife, and she cut one word into the stone: faithful. She did not speak at the burial. She stood with her hand on the stone for a long time, and the mountain was quiet around her, and the spring whispered inside. And after a while she went in and rebuilt the fire and made tea and sat by the hearth alone, in the way she had sat alone in the early days. But differently, not in isolation, in solitude. The difference between those two things had been one of the first things the mountain had taught her, and she had not forgotten it. Eli found her there an hour later and sat with her without speaking, which was what she needed and which he understood without being told. Many years later, on an autumn evening that smelled of cold stone and turning leaves, a girl sat down beside Freya at the cave entrance. She was young, not as young as Freya had been when she arrived here, but young enough that the weight of things had not yet fully declared itself. She had her grandmother's gray eyes, which had come from further back than that, from the women of a cold country who had looked at difficult things without looking away. "Were you ever scared?" she asked. Freya was quiet for a moment. Below them, the valley held its small lights in the early dark. The town that had been damaged and rebuilt, that had changed in the years since the storm in ways both obvious and invisible, went about its evening business with the steady, unhurried energy of a place that has been through something and has come out the other side of it. "Every single day," Freya said. "Every day for a long time." She looked at the valley. "The fear didn't go away. I just built anyway." "How?" "Because this was already here." She touched the stone of the entrance, the surface worn smooth by years of hands passing over it, including her own. "Someone built it before I came. For me, or for someone like me. And I understood that the right response to being given something you needed was to make sure it could be given again." The girl was quiet, considering this. "Will you teach me?" she asked. Freya looked at her, this child with her gray eyes and her willingness to ask the full question. The next one, the one who would come after. "Come back tomorrow," Freya said. "Bring good boots, and bring something useful." The girl smiled. "What kind of useful?" "You'll know," Freya said. "Think about what you know that no one else around you knows. Think about what your hands know that your head hasn't put words to yet." She looked at the cave entrance, at the ivy curtain, at the granite that had been holding its warmth for generations before either of them were born. "Start there." The girl nodded. She looked at the entrance for a moment, at the carved letters above it, worn by years but still legible, still holding their shape in the stone. "What does it say?" she asked. Freya looked at the letters she had first traced by firelight on a desperate night that now lived at the back of her memory like a lamp that never went completely out. Built for those who come after, she said. The girl read it again. Then she looked at Freya. And underneath, the other line, the newer one. Freya looked at the words that had been added by a different hand, in a different time. The carved inscription that had appeared one morning without announcement, left by someone who had decided the story needed its final line. She came, she built, she stayed. That one, Freya said quietly, is mine. The fire inside was burning. The spring was whispering. The mountain held its warmth as it always had, as it would hold it long after the last person who knew this story had passed the story on and let it go. Stone doesn't argue with cold. Stone waits. And the cave waited too, as it had always waited, patient and warm and ready for whoever came next through the curtain of ivy, carrying whatever they had, which was always enough. It was always enough.